Here is Big Bird. Big Bird is an individual who flies everywhere. He is extremely fit.
Here is Cookie Monster. Cookie Monster's hobby is to eat cookies. Therefore, Big Bird's lifestyle contributes to a better cardiometabolic health.
One Sunday morning, Big Bird and Cookie Monster decide to go for a nice cycle at the Ark. Big Bird and Cookie Monster cycled at the same power output, therefore they both have the same oxygen delivery. 30 seconds into their cycle, Cookie Monster's oxygen consumption was less than Big Bird's.
Before we get into further detail, let's talk about how ventilation and oxygen consumption work. While exercising, ventilation increases, increasing inflow of blood oxygen into our oxygen pool, which is the amount of oxygen in our blood. The outflow for oxygen is defined by consumption of oxygen used by our skeletal muscle, which occurs when the ETC is oxidized.
Basic understanding of ventilation, we can examine why Big Bird is using more oxygen at an earlier time of exercise compared to Cookie Monster. Big Bird and Cookie Monster have the same ventilation rate. This represents inflow to the blood oxygen pool. Blood oxygen is our mass. When cycling at the same power output, Big Bird has a higher oxygen consumption at 30 seconds. This suggests an earlier onset of aerobic metabolism and is a result of higher fitness levels. Furthermore, this means that Big Bird's outflow from the blood oxygen pool is higher at 30 seconds into exercise than Cookie Monster. With topics discussed in lecture, as well as with findings from Dudley's study on mitochondria and exercise kinetics, we can assume that Big Bird has more mitochondria and a higher proton motive force for a given ADP or substrate amount. This results in better efficiency of his electron transport chain, which is the process that uses oxygen consumed.
Let's look at the electron transport chain in more detail to examine how outflow of blood oxygen content is different in trained versus sedentary individuals, or Big Bird versus Cookie Monster. Ventilation is responsible for getting oxygen into the blood. The circulatory system then provides the working muscle with the oxygen needed to supply substrate for aerobic energy production. Once in the muscle cell, oxygen can enter the mitochondria, where it is used to create ATP through the electron transport and oxidative phosphorylation.
The electron transport chain is a coupled reaction. First, NADH and FADH2 supply electrons that reduce the electron transport chain. This allows for H+ ions to transport across the membrane, creating a gradient, also known as the chemiosmotic gradient or proton motive force. Oxygen in the cell then accepts electrons from subunit 4, and the electron transport becomes oxidized, ready to repeat the reduction-oxidation cycle, which maintains the proton motive force. Second in the coupled reaction is the turning of ATPase. The proton motive force and its hydrogen ion gradient provide energy to turn ATPase, phosphorylating ADP and producing ATP for the cell.
Electron transport occurs at the junction of the inner and outer mitochondrial membrane. There are many ETCs in ATP synthesis that work in conjunction to provide the cell with ATP from oxygen. Oxygen uptake in mitochondrial respiration is the combined rate of oxygen consumption across all ETCs. In trained individuals such as Big Bird, higher oxygen consumption at 30 seconds of exercise is observed. Big Bird is using more oxygen than Cookie Monster at 30 seconds, indicating a higher outflow from the blood oxygen pool. This can be due to a higher content of mitochondria, thus more ETCs and higher rate and efficiency of mitochondrial respiration.
With Big Bird, there are more mitochondria, therefore more ETCs. With more ETCs, there is greater likelihood of oxygen being consumed, thus oxidizing the ETCs. Since Big Bird and Cookie Monster have the same oxygen delivery through ventilation, with more mitochondria, more oxygen is consumed in Big Bird compared to Cookie Monster, since the number of mitochondria determines conductance. Therefore, the increase in oxygen consumption at 30 seconds of exercise seen in Big Bird can be attributed to the higher mitochondrial content in Big Bird, having more ETCs, increasing the likelihood that oxygen will accept electrons from the ETC, oxidizing the ETC.
In this study by Zoll and al., results confirm that a higher level of fitness may promote mitochondrial efficiency and a higher oxygen consumption uptake and VO2 max. 29 subjects were examined, all with varying fitness levels. This graph shows that the most athletic individuals had a higher oxygen consumption for a given ADP concentration. Sedentary individuals had lower oxygen consumption for a given ADP concentration.
The results of this study align with our hypothesis. This supports the hypothesis that Big Bird may have a higher oxygen consumption at a given work rate than Cookie Monster due to a higher fitness level. Therefore, we assume that Big Bird has more mitochondrial content than Cookie Monster. This contributes to the higher observed oxygen consumption in the ETC.